Greetings, Internet, and welcome to the latest and possibly greatest episode of the Comic Watcher Show. I'm your host, Matt Meyer. With me, as always, are mighty Mike Eakins, a.k.a. Scoop Johnson, and Nicholas Osborne. Gentlemen, how are you this week?
Doing good. Can't complain, right? Here to talk about some comics.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah, no, I'm good. A little rainy on here in Virginia, but we, like Nick said, let's talk some comics. We got the man, the myth, the legend.
Yeah, we got
it's gonna be awesome.
We have returning David Pepose. I swear I just butchered your name on live air.
No worries.
That guy that wrote Scout's Honor for AfterShock Comics.
Him.
He's
It's
coming
him.
back to talk to us some more about that book. It's wrapped up, but David, how the heck are you out there in sunny California?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's, we were talking a little bit before the show. It's been kind of a little bit of a whirlwind for me. I've been kind of in deadline hell the last few weeks, and I just moved to a new place a couple weeks back. And so I'm kind of excited. I feel like this is the first podcast I've done, or one of the first podcasts I've done since Scout's Honor concluded. So I'm excited to kind of take a moment to decompress, because I think there's part of me that still isn't convinced that the book is over. But no, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to talk comics with you.
Awesome, dude. Well, and we're just honored to have you back on the show.
Oh, please. The honor's all mine.
There's tons and tons to discuss about Scout's Honor, so I'm just going to put it out there for anyone listening. This is going to be a very spoilery episode of the show. So if you've not read Scout's Honor yet and you don't want things, very crucial things, ruined for you, maybe come read it and then come back. Or maybe you should just read it anyway. So first up, though, last time you were on, we were talking about your Kickstarter series, the OZ. The first volume of that is launched, and it launched pretty well. I understand that Volume 2 is presently in the works for an upcoming Kickstarter release.
Yes. So we're hoping to have that out. Beginning of June. So probably sometime right around after the July 4th holidays is, I think, the current goal. We've got some beautiful pages from Ruben Rojas, who's kind of hit a nice critical mass with pages, enough that I feel comfortable rolling out a Kickstarter for Volume 2. The book's been long written. I think I finished writing it right at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's been a long time coming. We had some COVID-related delays in the production schedule that couldn't be helped, couldn't be avoided. But we're now back on track, and Ruben's pages are looking beautiful. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to bring this back to Kickstarter. Now that Dorothy Gale has landed in the magical battlefield known as the Occupied Zone, she has joined the Resistance, led by the Tin Man and the Wizard of Oz. Now the things are going to ratchet up in a big way. It's going to be the quest for the Silver Slippers, sort of a weapon of mass destruction, unlike any other in the Land of Oz, because you can use it to bridge dimensions. And so you can turn what could be a self-contained war into kind of a never-ending campaign in the wrong hands. So yeah, Dorothy, she's going to have to turn to some really fun allies. Without spoiling too much, we'll get to meet our take on the Cowardly Lion in this next issue, as well as get some more time with Jack Pumpkinhead. So yeah, some really fun stuff coming. And Ruben's pages have just been really just knocking them way out of the park. I'm so thrilled to be working with him. And so, yes, keep an eye out. I'll be talking about it on my Twitter feed, on Facebook, and my newsletter, Pep Talks. But stay tuned, because the OZ will be returning to Kickstarter very soon.
That's so great, because the book is such just a breath of fresh air. And I mean, similar to Scout's Honor, it's kind of got one of those, why hasn't anybody thought of this before type of premises. And I know last time you were on, we were talking about the first Kickstarter and the first installment of the story and kind of the origins of it. But how does, you talked a little bit about the plot and which sort of opens the world up, it sounds like, in a big way for the OZ. But how, other than just gradually doing the world building that you've done,
Mhm.
does the OZ's second chapter, so to speak, like really rip and run and open doors for the story?
Issue 1 was the quiet issue. That's kind of the you know, that's really the all I can say is that we, you know, the stakes and the scale are much bigger for the next installment. You know, because issue 1, as much as I love issue 1, and I really do love issue 1, there was a lot of setup. You know, there was the world building. There was sort of introducing, you know, how did the land of Oz turn into the occupied zone? And you know, we even have like a little exposition dump in the back half of the book, just to be like, I knew we were going to have to get into it. So I was just like, all right, let's just do it and get through it. But now that we've got all the setup and Dorothy is where she's supposed to be, now we're really able to put pedal to the metal. We're able to spend more time introducing new characters. We're able to spend time going bigger and badder with the action sequences. And we're able to really kind of reinforce the stakes and show that, you know, Dorothy may have left one war behind, but that doesn't mean that war is finished with her. And so, yeah, there's some really fun twists coming in this second installment. I'd say if you like the twists that I did in Scout's Honor, I honestly think the twists I do in the OZ might be better. It's a very twisty book. And I mean, people have probably seen it just in the first installment. The Wizard of Oz, that's really all I'll say. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg. We've got at least a couple more twists that I'm like really, really proud of, especially in our third installment, which is like so far ahead that I don't even know when that's going to happen. But there's going to be a twist that's going to make some people like really just gasp hard. And I can't wait for people to get to see it.
Yeah, I'm super excited to see it. Really.
Go ahead. Oh.
Yeah, no, I want to follow up because there's so much exciting stuff happening within the actual story of the OZ.
Yeah.
But the campaign you ran for issue 1 was so successful. You had a $6,000 goal, and what you hit like $46,000.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're looking at issue 2 now. How do you elevate that campaign? How do you match that and exceed those expectations now following such a successful run in the first issue?
Well, thankfully, I think the big thing that I feel good about is I think most people really liked what we did with the OZ. Right. I think it's some of my best work, and working with Ruben and colorist Whitney Kogar and DC Hopkins on lettering. I really do think I've got a very stacked creative team, and the fact that we not only brought out a book that I think everybody liked, but we turned it in on time. We delivered it on time. And that was like during like the craziness of the election and the holidays and the postal service, like kind of rotting from within. And we managed to still deliver our items on time. And so for me, it's always just a matter of, you know, I hope we'll see a significant number of people come back. If not for the second issue, hopefully for the third issue. But you know, I think beyond that, honestly, I feel like we've already, you know, it's already a success. And so, you know, from here, everything else is just kind of the cherry on top. You know, just being able to say, all right, you know, we've got a certain benchmark that we can hit, and then knowing that everything else is just a fun extra. But you know, I've already been working ahead on some cool stuff. You know, looking at like, you know, potentially a new pin, for example, if we hit a certain benchmark, we've got something very cool in store for that. You know, the return of the, you know, the flying monkey stickers, we might have those. We might have a different kind of sticker. We're still figuring that one out. You know, some really cool prints that are going to go in the books. The variant covers we have are just outstanding. You know, I won't spoil too much of what we've got, but I will say that Mon House, who did our B cover, that outsold every single cover we did like 3-1. He's coming back for more, and he's got just a really outstanding looking cover with the lion. That's all I'll say.
Yes. Okay. And you recently, I have to stop things right here because you recently tweeted something with Mon House that is a cool little image about a kung fu project happening. Anything you can tell us with that?
Sure. It's going to be short and sweet. I can say that I've been wanting to work with Mon on interiors for a long time. Mon and I have worked together since the beginning of my career. He did my very first variant cover for Spencer and Locke. And so he's always done a variant for every series I've done. And but he and I have talked a lot about like, oh, we should do interiors together at some point. And so we have an anthology that we were invited, that I was invited to. And I was like, well, I know exactly what I want to do. I'm going to do a twist on a Kung Fu story that you won't see coming. It's kind of that kind of dumb that's like so good, so dumb. And Mon is putting that together right now. I'm hoping, he's told me he might have the story done by next week, which would be excellent. But I can tell you, for the pages he's turned in so far, super cool, super moody. This won't be the last time I work with Mon, and I'm very thrilled to see what pages are coming out. So yeah, I'll be talking about that, I think later this year. So, okay. Stay tuned. I think around the fall, I think I'll be able to say more about it.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Well, so you heard it here, maybe not first, but most authoritatively here, because you're also present. But the OZ Kickstarter Act 2, as it were, the Empire Strikes Back of the OZ verse. You can use that as a quote, David. But starting in about a month, just a little bit after 4th of July, jump in and back it, because this is an amazing story with just an excellent take on L. Frank Baum's World of Oz and the characters within it, and added layer of some really important and relevant things, such as soldiers coming home and having to cope with PTSD. So it's got a lot of real world relevancy on top of just the kick-ass flying monkeys. So having said that, you should absolutely back it. But let's get into Scout's Honor from AfterShock.
Yeah.
It just wrapped up. David, of course, wrote it. Luca Casalanguida was on art, along with Matt Mila on colors and Carlos Mengual on letters. Brother David, we were talking a little bit before the show, and you were talking about just decompressing from this ride of Scout's Honor. And I mean, I'm totally expecting that from an artistic perspective, and I would imagine many creators feel that same way. But this book blew up, and I mean, it just got all kinds of crazy critical hype and hit some huge sales peaks and sellouts. And man, how are you feeling about all that?
It hasn't really sunk in, in a big way. Like we were talking about before the show, I've been locked in deadline hell for the last couple of weeks on top of a move. And so I haven't really had a chance to let it kind of sink in. And there's part of me that's still like, oh yeah, another issue is going to come out soon and I'm going to promote that. And I'm like, no, you're done. There's no more. There's a trade coming. I think this is the first time that I've had a gap in between the last issue coming out and the trade. Working with Action Lab, they usually do the trade. It's usually supposed to be a month after the last issue comes out, but based on the way that a couple of my series have had printer delays, it usually comes out right after the last issue. So I'm kind of like, oh yeah, I got to promote that trade in a month. But yeah, it's been great. Seeing the way that people respond to this book, it always feels like a roll of the dice. But this one really felt like a roll of the dice to me. I was very much I don't know if people are going to bite on this one. I hope they do, but you never know. This was the first book that, for example, I developed for a publisher. I had sort of said, here's a list of log lines. And of course, Scout's Honor was the one I had come up with a week and a half before. And they were like, that's the one that developed that. And so I really kind of brought this book together in a much more accelerated fashion than I do usually any of my other projects. And on top of that, it does kind of go against the grain in terms of the direct market. On the one hand, you've got the post-apocalyptic side, which I think is very popular and it's clearly in vogue. Sure. But I think a lot of the political tones to this book, I think, it'd be very easy for a certain kind of direct market fan to kind of raise their hackles with it, and so I was very much like, I'm walking a high wire here. I want to make sure that people like it and that people are entertained by it, but people also respond to the messaging that kind of came forth out of the core concept. And so I'm really thrilled that people seem to really respond to it in a big way. And yeah, I mean, it's funny. People keep saying like, "Oh, are you going to do like a sequel?" And I'm like, "Oh man, I can't even acknowledge mentally that the first volume is done." I say never. Sequels are really hard as somebody who's in the middle of writing a sequel for Spencer and Locke right now. They are very, very hard. And it's sort of every time you have another issue, you're sort of, the law of averages is going to work against you at some point. And so there's part of me that's like, okay, I got it through one arc in one piece. Do I want to roll the dice again? But I say never. I really love those characters. Kit has been a super fun character to follow. Dez honestly kind of stole the show for me. I loved every scene I wrote with Dez. He was just such a fun character. And so I could see more stories with either of them in the future. So never say never. There's no plans currently, but who knows when that could change.
Mike, let's get you in on the conversation, bud.
For sure, that's great. And Dave, thanks for jumping in, because I was, going to ask, are we going to see more Kit and Dez? But since you answer that one, we'll throw that one question out. Kidding. Sure. No, with Kit, and we see a lot, especially in issue 5, the culmination of her desire and her will to be just perseverance, just the poster child for perseverance. What is her fuel? What gives her that drive to be that strong female character that isn't going to just stop at anything?
I think it's ultimately idealism. I think she the moment she met a Ranger Scout, she was like, well, that's it. That's what I want to be. Sort of this epitome of justice, and fairness and just good in a bad world, in a world that's taken a lot from her. The ideal of the Ranger Scouts and sort of her idea of saying, well, I could be one of these guys. I could be sort of somebody who fights for the little guys, somebody who fights for justice in a world that doesn't care about it. And I think that idealism kind of carries her through what, kind of the harsh sting of reality, which is really kind of what this book is about in a lot of ways, is, you're raised in a certain way and you're raised with certain values. And then you find out that like the world is not following that. And so it becomes really a test of faith, as much as it is a test of character, where it becomes, you could just kind of roll over and, the world is a crappy place and you could become a crappy person, or you can kind of dig your heels in and say, you know what, I don't care how bad the world is. That's not gonna break me. And that was really an interesting place for Kit to be. I think there's a lot of stories where you either have a character who makes a big change, over the course of their arc, or alternatively, you have a story where the character doesn't change at all and the world changes around them. And I think this was an interesting way of kind of splitting the two, of sort of, having her have this crisis of faith and then kind of come out on the other side with her faith redoubled. And I think it's not the type of story you're able to write much. It doesn't always work that way organically. And I think it was kind of a almost a happy accident, or not even happy accident. It was just the concept kind of led me to this arc, as opposed to, it being by design or it being by accident. I just kind of said, all right, I have this concept here and I'm going to kind of follow it through to the end and see what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I'm super happy you touched on that, because that was really my biggest question after I finished issue 5.
Yeah.
We're going to get into spoiler territory here, guys, real quick. Just a forewarning, if you haven't read it, stop it, pause now, go read it, come back. In issue 4, we have a moment where Kit is kicked out of the scouts, pushed out into the Badlands, I believe, and, kind of as good as dead pretty much. And this is the moment where we feel like, this is where Kit's character breaks down, and this is where Kit's going to lose her faith in everything that she's been through. And now she's going to have to like find her own identity now and go through this journey. But like you said, she doubles down on her faith. She says a prayer basically, and she finds strength in that. And that was such a turn of events that I did not see coming. And it turned the story into a positive interpretation of faith in a way that you really don't see much in the industry right now. It seems like stories aren't really willing to handle that topic, and you've done it with such tact and such respect that I could not get that thought out of my head. Even with issue 5 and everything that's happening in issue 5, I was still just zoomed in on that one topic, and it carried through into issue 5 as well. When we see the final page, when it's like we're building it right here, you can see that sort of doubling down on faith. So I wanted to see if you could just kind of elaborate on that and speak to, the importance of that theme.
Well, I think so much of it speaks to kind of the way I was raised. I grew up, I'm Jewish, and growing up Jewish, it really was an important part of my identity. And I think the thing I like most about Judaism is that there are a lot of religions where it's like it's very hard and fast, kind of what you do. Judaism, there's so many different denominations, and there's such a wide spectrum of belief and practice and interpretation. And, you could be as secular as you want to be, but you still identify, or you could be super religious and still identify. And I feel like I've always been kind of somewhere in the middle, like kind of trying to find my own sort of spirituality and my own connection to those who've come before. There's been a lot of people who have fought and died, not being able to practice anything or dying to practice something. And so my spiritual practice is always sort of, it's my way of throwing a penny in the well of the universe, so to speak. And so I think this is in a lot of ways the most Jewish book I've ever written. I think it's difficult to write a Jewish book in today's marketplace in a way that doesn't feel either like Fiddler on the Roof or like Mel Brooks or isn't like a specific Holocaust themed thing. It's just it doesn't show up a whole lot in pop culture. But I think my way of being able to kind of approach faith as a double-edged sword, and something that it can be used in a very negative way, and it can be used to justify these really horrific things. But on the other hand, it can be a source of strength. It can be a source of values. It can be a positive thing. It can be your faith and your connection to that faith can be the thing that brings you over the finish line when you've got nothing else left in the tank. And I'm so glad you liked the 4th issue. That was my favorite issue of the whole run. And I think it's in part because it went so against the grain of what you usually see in a direct market book. It was kind of a quieter issue, but it was one that Kit is sort of alone with her thoughts and having to kind of grapple with all of that. And I think that's not. I think everybody's got a different take on faith, and I think a lot of that deals with the way they were raised and their experiences with religion and their experiences with spirituality and their experiences with faith, which does not always necessarily overlap. But I think I ultimately feel like everybody believes in something that's bigger than themselves. Look, the fact that we're all on this podcast, like, I think we all believe in comics.
Right.
And there are people who they believe in the Boy Scouts, and that's sort of their framework for living. We all have it. And I think when things start to get really troubling in the world, we either lose sight of the things that we believe in most, or we cling to it more. And I don't want to pretend like I have an answer to any of this. I'm just one comic book writer, but this was sort of my way of taking a swing at it. I'm really thrilled that people saw it for what it was, which is, it may be an anti-cult book. It's not an anti-religion book. It's not an anti-faith book. And just being able to kind of weave in between the action and the mythology behind it, but also kind of the very core human stakes Seeing Kit, who has to kind of conceal a big part of who she is in order to pursue her calling. Des, which is part of the reason why I love Des so much, is like he's the closeted son of the pastor, and he has to deny and hide a major part of who he is, and that shame drives him. And sometimes drives him to a bad place, but eventually he kind of confronts it. And I think is physical and literal the way as possible. And being able to kind of weave between these different threads, that's what made me fall in love with this book, in a way that even when AfterShock first asked me to develop it, it sort of went from a oh crap kind of reaction. Of course, they picked the one that I have done like no homework on. To by the time that the book was done, I felt like really proud of it and really excited for it. And I'm excited kind of to go back to the wilderness of conventions soon and really be able to see how people react to that book in context.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. There's a lot to unpack with sort of the character dynamics that's happening here with Kit, having to basically disguise themselves as a male to just be a part of the Scouts, to what I had no idea was coming in like a Mulan twist with this character. You basically have Mulan and Li Shang here, who is like, I'm attracted to this character and I really don't know why, but I feel like I shouldn't be. Right. There's sort of that dynamic here happening between Kit and Des. So I see you toying with sexuality and the expression of gender. Yeah. And, there's a lot of misogyny, like woven into the Scouts' honor and even into the laws. But it's not the story that you would expect.
It's funny because so much of that came after AfterShock said, okay, develop this. Because I had said, when I had pitched it, it was literally just 2 sentences. I was just like, Boy Scout cult, and somebody finds out that the Boy Scouts aren't quite as heroic as they portrayed themselves to be. And as soon as AfterShock said go for it, I was like, but like I said, my first reaction was awesome, and then oh crap, and then this is a book that's all dudes. I can't, like, how is this going to work? Right. And I realized, like, oh, well, like, you can lean into that. It is weird to have a book that's all dudes, unless it's like, look, if it's something like a military book, that kind of like makes some sense in context. But 9 times out of 10, or even 98 times out of 100, it's not going to make any sense. Right. So I was like, okay, lean into it. And I was like, all right, what's it like for a woman having to navigate this world? What's it like for a member of the LGBT community to have to navigate this world? The Boy Scouts heteronormativity is the name. It's literally baked into the name. And I was like, oh, lean into it. And that's where I think that's where the story started working. Is being able to kind of be like, all right, like, let's interrogate some of this weirdness here, and realizing like, oh, this is like prevalent, this is not just the Boy Scouts. This is like American culture and honestly, world culture. So I think that that really kind of that made me feel a lot better about the story. Made me feel a little bit more confident as I was building stuff up, because I was like, oh, it's not just, the surface level Boy Scout post-apocalyptic stuff is cool, but being able to be like, okay, there's something else here. There's some sort of deeper character growth. There's some sort of deeper message. And that, I think, kind of helped me really embrace this story in a big way.
Yeah. Well, and going, you mentioned sort of some of the inherent weirdness of the Boy Scouts. Sure. And I was a Boy Scout for a couple of years when I was a kid. I think most kids were at some point, or at least tangentially had some kind of exposure to them. And even when I was a kid, like, I noticed it, just a lot of the ceremony and just, I don't know, there's just something weird about it. And cult might be too strong of a word, but it's not a huge leap to get from point A to point B in that regard. Right. And I just think that's such a fascinating concept, how you can take something that is, at least on the surface, wholesome and good, and just how easily it's twisted around, because you see it with in the real world, how it's only just recently been that gay scoutmasters can serve openly. Yep. And it's only just been recently that girls can join, which is kind of humorous. The sidebar is really pissed off the Girl Scouts, right. But maybe not so humorous. I don't know. I still want my cookies, but just, it's one of those things that there's so many just little subtle layers and nuances to it. And what was it about the Scouts themselves that made you start thinking, hey, I could do something with this?
Well, some of it comes from actually very similar to what you were talking about. My younger brothers were Scouts, not for very long, but they were certainly Scouts for a little while. And that was my initial gut reaction. I've got about 9 years on my younger siblings. And so, as I was a teenager and they were kind of young, and just being like, oh yeah, that could be a cult. You don't have to squint too hard with the costumes and the pageantry and the bylaws. And, and I think any sort of organization or kind of subculture, once you kind of, everything in moderation, and if right. you could certainly look at comics as a cult. You could look at video games as a cult. You could look at, any sort of sports team as a cult. The thing that kind of got me with the Boy Scouts was the initial kernel of the idea was thinking about how history is kind of a game of telephone, and what would happen if we cut that game, and what kind of scraps would we be looking at from the old world and being like, well, that thing, that's the Bible. And so I thought, what's the weirdest thing that we could have from the old world that would look like a Bible? And as soon as I thought Boy Scout, it's like you could hear the click, because it works in terms of how do you have that isolation from human history. It was either going to be an apocalyptic world, or it was going to be like a Lord of the Flies, trapped in an island somewhere. And I felt like
screwed.
Yeah, me too.
Versus Boy Scouts, we would all be, well, maybe not Mike, but the rest, 3/4 of us would be just toast in just 5 minutes.
And the post-apocalyptic thing I realized very quickly, well, that's easier, if it'd be more fun to have the cult already built than watch the cult get built. And so I was like, all right, post-apocalyptic. And I was like, yeah, that fits really well then, the Boy Scouts, because it's all about survival stuff. And thinking oh yeah, there's a lot of really rich iconography to the Boy Scouts, which, really kind of anything that's got a lot of iconography that really kind of draws me in, whether it's the Wizard of Oz, whether it's Calvin and Hobbes, whether it's weddings, and for my book Going to the Chapel. And so the Boy Scout iconography was it was too good to resist. I was just like, okay, there's something cool here. I'm excited to kind of dig in and see what happens. But yeah, it was definitely, and I have friends who, they still say in their Twitter bios, Eagle Scout.
Yeah. Bro, you're 39.
Yeah,
say the 4 adults talking about comic books.
Yeah, right? That was literally just thinking that.
Well, that's the thing. For them, it's just as serious as any religion,
right?
And and so it became, I always say my tactic is I come up with concepts that look like trash when you have it written down, and then I make you cry about it. And I feel like that's kind of that's what I did for Scouts Honor, was I was just post-apocalyptic Boy Scouts, on its face sounds ridiculous, but being able to be no, take it very seriously. And you need to take it very seriously as a reader.
I can see that where you're coming from in that regard. Just kind of even briefly thinking about your past greatest hits. Spencer and Locke. What if Calvin and Hobbes grew up?
Yeah.
The OZ. What if there? It was Oz stood for occupied zone, and there was lots of war. I mean, it just, you're an idea guy. And
it's fun,
dude. Run with it.
We have fun here. And yeah, it's just those are the sorts of things. I will say it also makes it a little easier to sell these books, I mean, not to be mercenary about it, but I want people to read the books. And so being able to say, oh, it's about a post-apocalyptic cult and their Bible's an old Boy Scout manual. I feel like that's like the sort of thing that people are like, oh yeah, that's interesting. I really want to see. It's kind of like framing it like a joke and figuring out like, how do you twist it so you surprise somebody on the punchline? What if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City? Yeah. What if Die Hard met Wedding Crashers? What if the Wizard of Oz met Mad Max? And people are just like, they laugh and they're like, well, I have to check that out. And then the big trick is, I'm like, well, you're actually gonna like it. You're actually gonna care about these characters.
Here's the tricky needle to thread, though, because you or whomever, whatever creator, can come up with the most amazing story in the world, most unique concept ever. But if I don't care about the characters, I'm only going to be halfway into it.
100%.
Kit, Dez, hell, even the Scoutmaster to a degree.
Yeah.
They're compelling characters.
Thank you.
Because we can relate to them. I think. And there's a very Shakespearean element to Kit, what with her binding of herself.
I'm gonna dine out on that forever.
Well, I was actually describing her character to a theater major that I work with today, and that was the first thing out of his mouth. I was like, "Oh shit! Why didn't I realize that before?" But
honestly, you can tell them I didn't really realize that until you just said it.
Pretty funny.
I'd love to say that was like all intentional.
Right.
No, Shakes who? But no, I mean, I agree with you. Like, the first thing that I always ask when I'm kind of coming up with a character is like, why do I give a damn? Like, why should you give a damn? Mm-hmm. And usually that's why, like, I usually lead towards trauma, because I feel like that's something we can all relate to some extent. And that's a through line that all of my characters have shared to some extent. Kit is the only difference with Kit is that she hasn't like marinated in it for extended periods of time. Like, we kind of get to watch her get thrown off her axis in real time,
right?
And watch her kind of have to find her feet again. But yeah, finding characters with trauma, with guilt, with shame. I mean, and figuring out how to overcome those things. I think that's something that I think a lot of us struggle with. I certainly struggle with it. And I'm sure a lot of comics readers struggle with it. And so being able to kind of say like, no, we can relate, you can see people having a rough time of it too, but knowing that like they can crawl their way out. Like they can claw their way out of the depths. And I think people really respond to that. I think it makes them feel a little hopeful that like maybe they can claw their way out of the depths too. Mm-hmm. I just I believe in happy endings. I think that goes a long way. And I think it makes people feel good and it makes them feel like maybe a happy ending is ahead. And I think that was very important, especially for a post-apocalyptic book. A genre that I had purposefully avoided for the last 4 years for a reason. Just like it didn't kind of want to put that kind of energy into a world that was already kind of careening in that direction. And so the thing I told myself was, well, if I do a post-apocalyptic book like this, like I can't make it bleak. I can't make it bleak for bleakness' sake. The world has too much of that. And so having some characters that you can really feel something for, I think it gives the book its heart. And I think it makes it gives it a surprisingly lighter touch for a genre that's not known for a light touch. And I think it makes it a little bit more palatable and a little bit easier to swallow.
So you mentioned the past 4 years, excuse me, and obviously it's been a pretty fraught time for Americans, and to say the least. And but a lot of the cult of personality tendencies that we see in the Ranger Scouts are things that are really just reflections of things that we saw reflected in our politics in 100%. Some really negative and nasty ways. Did you take things that were happening on the news to a degree to magnify and reflect in Scouts Honor in that regard?
It's weird because so I pitched this book before the pandemic. Well before the pandemic. I pitched it, I'm going to say August of 2019. And I had been told, I think around the holidays of 2019, that like, this is greenlit, we're going to run with this. But based on like just kind of some internal stuff over at AfterShock, I didn't get my contract until about 2 weeks before everything shut down. And so I wrote 80% of the book. I had already written the first issue with just some minor tweaks. I wrote issues 2 through 5 under lockdown. I wrote it from March through. I turned in the last issue just before the July 4th holiday, and yeah, it was definitely, it felt like a little too real at times. The suicide hornets were certainly my nod to the murder hornets of 2020. I was like, I have to have murder hornets in this book. It just feels like too timely. But yeah, I think, the other thing that I haven't really talked about in this podcast, but I think it's very important to how the book was developed. I was raised in a very conservative upbringing, very conservative politically, very conservative religiously. And it wasn't until I left home for the first time that I realized, like, all these things I was told were like Republican things, small government that stays out of your bedroom and stays out of your womb and stays out of your religion, and common sense guidelines like gun control, all those things. I realized, like, oh, that's not the Republican platform. It's just, like somebody sat me down. They're like, you're pro-choice, you're pro-gun control, and you're pro having a welfare net. I was like, yeah, of course. They're like, you're a Democrat. And I was like, oh, that would have saved me a lot of hassle in high school. But, it was very like disorienting, at the time. And I credit a lot of the friends that I made in college to kind of like helping me figure that out. And I think by the time that I graduated, the recession was bearing down on me as a graduate. That made me kind of say, well, I'm never voting, in that direction ever in my entire life. But I think that experience really mirrors Kit in a lot of ways. I've sort of realizing she was raised in this particular way, and she had values that spoke to the way she was raised. Mm-hmm. And then realizing that, like, this is not really as a bedrock as I thought it was.
Right.
And so, and kind of figuring out, like, well, what values do you keep and what things do you have to leave behind and what do you kind of fill in its place? That was an ongoing political and spiritual journey for me.
Well, it helps to kind of go back to another point you were making earlier, that spirituality and whatever your personal creed is not the same thing as religion and institutions. And 100%. A lot of people don't understand that distinction.
Sure. And I think a lot of it is, it's where you grow up and how you're raised and the people I think, especially growing up Jewish, you kind of, you that you're not the majority by any means. And that, like, if you tried to, like, proselytize to somebody, they'd, like, kick your ass in the street. So, like, just, and so I think as a result, like, I've been the only Jewish kid in my class. I've been the only Jewish kid at my job, my partner was raised Catholic. And so that, I sort of am sharing that part of my culture with her. And I think that really has colored not just my perspective on this book, but just kind of how I navigate the world. And I think that's why I say Scout's Honor in a lot of ways is the most Jewish book I've ever written, and probably is the most Jewish book I'll write for some time, because it's able to sort of universalize some of the ways that I felt growing up in a way that isn't so specific that somebody feels alienated or called out or can't connect with it. This is sort of taking those feelings of taking your spiritual and ethical journey and trying to broaden it as best as I can.
Right. I really love that because honestly, I wish 18-year-old Nick would have had this book because I
thank
was
you.
raised Southern Baptist
Mhm.
and I went through that where I moved out of the house and the world wasn't what I was told it would look like, and interactions with people weren't what I was told they would be.
Yeah.
And I had to navigate that and find that identity and understand these values that were instilled in me from growing up
Yeah.
and how to interact in a world that didn't resemble that. But I really love how tapping back into that twist in issue 4, that's not the moment where you abandon everything and say everything I've ever known is lost and now I have to find some new path.
Yeah.
It was all about an understanding of self and how it applies to the world around you.
Yeah. And just saying, what feels like me, what feels like me, because that's the thing. You don't have to give up the things that make you. And I think that's really kind of the theme of Scouts Honor in a big way, is that like Kit can be a woman and a Ranger Scout. These things do not have to be in conflict. Des can be a Ranger Scout and his father's son and be gay. And these things do not have to clash. And sometimes the way that our society turns out, or the way that our parents turn out, or the way that our environment turns out, it takes these things that are just as equal and true and tries to pit them against each other. It makes it a conflict.
Yeah, right.
And I think it can be really cathartic to realize like it doesn't have to be. And it's a challenge. It's hard, and I hate when other people make it hard.
Yeah.
Because that I think is
it's not these things. It's not a zero-sum game.
Right. Exactly that. And I think we move slowly, but we are moving in the right direction. I think the way that representation, and I think comics, it's so important to have representation in some capacity, because look, I know it's baby steps and I know it's moving slower than it should, but seeing where we are now versus where we were even 10 years ago, it's like, it's a marked difference.
Sure.
And I think, hopefully in some very small way, we're kind of able to kind of add on to the pile a bit. And if somebody reads the book and sort of feels seen, or feels like it reflects their experience, or their upbringing or their journey in some way, I feel really lucky, and it becomes my honor, to really to help anybody on their path.
Right on, dude. That's what's up.
Yeah, and this is a book that can help people on their path, because we don't see this enough in the industry, and understanding that things that are typically pitted against each other don't need to be that way.
Yeah.
And that journey, I think, is where you found the heart in this story and where you found voice in it. And as much as it's a commentary on American culture and us navigating our way through that, and all of these different dualities that we are, confronted against, it's really that sense of heart that makes this book one that you really can't help but say you need to read this whenever you come across it.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you see this book on a shelf at the comic shop, there's no way you're going to forget it now, right? Like, that story, and it's what drives the questions of like, can we get more? Where all of that comes from is, we relate so hard to this, and we understand the importance of this message and the story and the world around it, not just because it's a fun apocalyptic world, but because of the message it inherently carries with it. I mean, even at the end, you've got the scouts and the highwaymen kind of finding their way together in the world that they're building. And it's a of hope. I say this as a Walking Dead fan who Robert Kirkman pretty vehemently states that it's a hopeful series and that it's about humanity finding hope, but it's so bleak. Yeah. And I feel like that's that's an understatement of the century to say The Walking Dead is bleak. Yeah. But you've done it. You've done the genre in a way that you can say it's hopeful, and you can pick up on that really easily, and it's genuine.
Yeah, no, I mean, no disrespect to Robert, but when he says it's hopeful, I'm like, I'm not sure that word means what you think it means. I like Walking Dead just as much as anybody. I don't know if hopeful is the word I use to describe it, but if that helps him write it, that good for him. But yeah, it's just I mean, it's not to say that like. I do want to write like a bleak horror story at some point, but I at least for now, especially where we've been at these last few years. I mean, the majority of my work, and certainly everything that's been published up until this point, was written during the Trump administration. With the exception of the first volume of Spencer and Locke, which was written and finished before the election. Everything since volume 2, Go to the Chapel, the OZ, Grand Theft Astro, a few other books that we have not announced yet, Scout's Honor, all were written during those 4 years. And I'll admit, I was pretty pissed off those 4 years. And kind of, figuring out just a way to kind of channel it in a way that I could be angry and I don't think the books would have legs. And so figuring out a way to channel it in a way that I'm like, I'm angry about what's going on in the world. And so I'm going to write things that repudiate that.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. If you give in to the negativity that's surrounding you, I mean, all you're doing is reciprocating its cycle.
Right.
So I absolutely get where you're coming from with wanting to write something super hopeful. Like, and I'll give you a perfect example. I haven't watched The Boys yet. I read all the comics. I know what I'm in for, but I just don't need that level of cynicism in my life right now.
Sure. I totally get it. And I think I'm grateful that I feel like we're making a turn. We are. It's a slow crawl. Yes. And to go back to what you were saying earlier, and to borrow a pretty heavy quote, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I firmly believe that. Sure. And books like Scout's Honor speak to that hopefulness that the future is an inherently better place. Yeah, I mean, even in the depths of the apocalypse, we can do better.
Even with the gamma bores.
Even with the gamma bores. And yeah, I'm just, I didn't know how people were going to respond to it. I didn't know if it was going to be kind of one of those too soon kind of books. But I'm really grateful for how everybody seemed to respond to it.
Yeah.
And I'm just excited for people to see what else I have coming, because my goal from book to book is to really kind of show my range and earn my place in this business. And so I've got a few things that are coming down the pike. Very few of them have been announced yet. Some of them don't even have homes yet, but I'm very excited. I think by 2022, 2023, you're going to see a lot more books with my name on it, and a variety of different genres.
Ooh, and I have to take a minute. I know we're closing in on our hour here to follow up on something you talked about in wanting to write maybe a bleak horror story. But I want to follow up on the thread that we've got in Scout's Honor, that it takes a trope that you might, where you think this character is going to lose their faith and it's a faith-based principle and they're going to abandon it, but they actually wield it in a way that's positive.
Sure.
We've seen, one of my favorite subgenres of horror is religion inspired. So there's a lot of possessions, a lot of that. And a lot of that deals with the breaking of faith or the loss of faith. And that's what creates, or that's what the catalyst is for horror. Could you take that approach that doesn't wield the loss of faith and apply it to a bleak horror story as well?
Yes. I can say that I am actually in the process of working on a horror book that is certainly a spiritual cousin in that regard. That certainly deals with the idea of creativity being kind of that moral cousin in a way. So I've written the first issue of it. I'm really happy with it. And I actually, as soon as I'm out of these deadlines, I need to get back to work on it. But yeah, I think I'm always trying to do a different flavor for each of my books. This is probably going to be the most overtly spiritual book that I write for some time.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of the idea of sort of horror coming from your morals being tested. I think that's a very powerful theme, and one that I definitely plan to explore.
Awesome. I can't wait.
I think I can speak for all of us, especially Nick, because he's our resident horror guru, that we're really psyched to see that. And what comes of that, and also the Kung Fu book that you referenced earlier.
Yeah,
As we close in on our hour and we're talking about hopefulness and things getting, a little bit more back to, a new normal, you mentioned getting out into conventions earlier, and Mike, you had actually had a question regarding conventions, brother. Why don't you take us home with it?
Yeah, the conventions. You're starting to see more conventions get the guest list out and stuff like that. Baltimore has a list out. I think New Jersey does. Is there any conventions in your future? Obviously in the future, obviously, but say like in the more near future that you see yourself trying to get booked with or going to?
Yeah. I have to double check. I think my first con back, unless my booth didn't carry over, is I'm pretty sure I'm scheduled for Rose City coming up soon. I applied for New York and Emerald City. I'm waiting to hear back on those. Those are the cons that I've got on my radar for 2021. But 2022, I really want to kind of come back in full force. I miss C2E2, Denver. I really miss. I really want to do Comic Palooza. I was going to do it for the first time last year, and obviously then COVID hit, and so the con didn't happen. There are a few others that MegaCon, had a lot of fun there. New York, of course. Maybe Fan Expo Boston. We'll see. The thing is, I will say during COVID, I wrote like 4 books because I didn't travel. And so there's part of me that's kind of like, maybe you should pick your battles a little bit so you can actually do your job of writing books. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, I'm in such a weird place now than I was even a year ago, where I'm sort of juggling a lot of different projects that like haven't been announced or don't have a date yet, or we're just finding art teams on them now. And so it's kind of like, doing that while sort of flexing my muscles of like, I still have to write stuff. I think I have, let's see, I'm not going to spoil anything, but let's see. Astro, OZ.
Yeah, I'm like turning my volume up here.
Stop that. He has a process.
Speak in the microphone.
I have 8 projects I'm working on.
That's pretty major, dude.
That is.
Thank you. And don't get me wrong, the majority of them don't have homes yet. It's like still very preliminary, kind of putting teams together. Yeah. But 2 of those are the outlines that I owe right now. And so it's kind of figuring out, like, I seem quiet on the outside, and the inside I'm like way busier than I even was a year ago. And so it's just, it's figuring out, how do you juggle all of this? And I feel really fortunate that I'm in a position that I can kind of figure that out. And that, I've had success at conventions. And so I know that, like, if I go do a show, I'll come back with rent. It'll be fine. It's just, I feel like the next couple of outlines, once stuff starts really building, it's going to be a busy couple of years, but that's exactly the kind of busy that you're hoping for.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if you're just going to keep making more comics on par with Scouts Honor, I'd say that's time well spent.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Just make sure at some point in your life you make it to a con in Texas so that Nick and I can swing down and buy you a beer.
Comic Palooza, for sure. I definitely want to do that show, and I probably will in 2022. So look me up.
There it is.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm usually there every year. I would love to see you.
Excellent. I can't wait.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you so much for hanging out with us again.
My pleasure.
I mean, the folks, the book is Scouts Honor. It is just top shelf, unique, fun, and hopeful comics reading, and it does have Gamma Boars. and Mad Max and Boy Scouts that are crazy and binding and lots of cool shit, and you just need to read it. The collected edition comes out, I believe, in September. David, is that correct?
Yep.
So if you want to wait for a physical copy to hold and love and cherish forever, that's when it is. But the singles are all on sale now too, and by all means, we love it when people support their local comic shop. So with that, we are the Comic Watchers, and this is our show. I'm your host, Matt Meyer. With me, as always, Nicholas Osborne, Mike Eakins, and David Pepose has been with us. He's been a wonderful guest. Thank you guys so much. And we will see you guys next week. Until then, be kind, read something cool, and go forth and conquer, man.
There you go.